Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Pinedo Brothers Podcast. I'm your host, Peter, and I have with me my brother.
Hey, I'm JP.
Yeah, we got Peter and JP back in the house, and this is the third episode of the Pinedo Brothers Podcast. Now that we've resumed our, what is this, the fourth season?
4. That's right.
Season 4 now. Yes, so we're back and better than ever. And today we're talking about how to write stories, how to tell stories. But as you know, both JP and I are Catholic filmmakers and storytellers, and our mission has always been to revitalize the world of Catholic art through stories that are about faith, not just faith films. And now this transfers into the writing world as well. And so we want to discuss a little bit today our experience and some of our practical tips and tricks for how to be a storyteller, how to tell a story that is entertaining and also interesting, and maybe it shares a bit of your Christian perspective and Christian worldview in a world and society that's very much lacking for that right now. So unless we have any notes or objections, JP, we'll go ahead and get started.
No objections from this quarter.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, before we get started, why we have any authority at all to speak on this topic. Both of us are artists and storytellers, and we love, I think from both the time when we were children, both of us really loved reading and consuming stories. And from a very young age, I know I definitely started writing stories from, the point where I could hardly spell. Started writing little stories. And, I don't know what happened to most of them, but from a very young age, I always loved doing that. And then, of course, eventually I wrote The Unfollowed, a novel that is available on Amazon, which you can still get up on over there on Amazon. But today now I'm a reporter for the Catholic News Agency. So I get to tell stories and write stories for a living, which is pretty awesome, something I didn't exactly anticipate or foresee, not a very long time ago. So it's pretty cool. And JP, of course, also is a writer, and you also write for a living. That's pretty cool as well. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience?
My writing is a little bit different than yours, that I write when I write for a living, although I do use writing every day in my day job, as well as when I moonlight and I write screenplays. I work more in marketing for my day job, so I'm writing a lot of emails, a lot of blog posts, a lot of social copy. I very much look at each thing that I do as a short story, though. In college, I loved writing short stories, and so these are really short stories, but they're still that same sort of feel, storytelling feel. Of course, my favorite thing to do is writing screenplays. I have written probably 8 or 9 now, and the latest is
full-length ones, right?
Yep, full-length ones.
Yeah.
Short, I don't know how many shorts I've written, but 8 or 9 full-length. I guess I have to count them up. And the latest is the Socrati, which you can pre-order now. But in any case, back to you.
Yeah, we'll have the link in there,
Yeah.
in the description, so you can pre-order our upcoming project, the Socrati, which also involved a whole lot of writing and rewriting and all of that, which can be very intimidating, I think, for a new writer. And so I think that's kind of our first step that I wanted to discuss, is getting over that fear and that intimidation of writing. I know there's a lot of people out there who are fans of writing, that they love doing it. But there's definitely this type of stigma and this fear that as a writer, I think you have to get over in order to get started on your project. I think for me, the biggest piece of advice that I ever, give to people when they're asked about writing and what's my method and all that is to just get started. I think both of us, our dad used to always talk about, like, if you want to get started writing, if all you can write is your name, just put down your name, and at least that gets you starting to write something. And so really that's the first battle. If you can start that process, then you you're already, going through it now. I don't know if you have any tips and tricks for getting over that fear, or if you even face that fear. Can you tell us something about that?
It's interesting. The easiest way to write, and every student knows this, is if you have a deadline, you know? So if you're writing something creatively on your own time, when you don't have a deadline, that can be the most difficult thing to do. So the best thing to do is to make time precious, like make that, make those deadlines and make them real to yourself. Like say, okay, I need to have this much written by this time. And it's fine if it's bad. Don't try and edit while you're writing. I mean, people have probably heard that ad nauseum at this point, but it's for real. It's fine. Like one of the tricks I would always do is say, well, this is really bad, but I just will never show it to anyone. So it's fine. I'll never show it to anyone. So it doesn't matter how bad it is. I'm just going to keep on going. And then after you're done, you can go back and reevaluate and say, okay, well, maybe there's something worthwhile here. And voila, you have a story after you've edited it a few times. It's something that maybe you don't mind people seeing or reading. But like you said, apply the seat of the pants to the chair and get going. Even if it's you're staring at a blank screen for a while, once your deadline is looming enough, you'll have to start writing something. And that's I think where your creative spirit enters in.
Yeah, I know definitely there's a lot of people who prefer the procrastination method, where you wait till the very end, and then you feel that pressure and that inspiration to get through. So that's a valid method of doing it. If that's what you do, it's probably not the most comfortable way to get things done, but hey, if you get the job done, I think it's a valid way of doing it.
Well, it can be comfortable if it's your own deadlines, if it's not someone else's deadlines. It's like, okay, I have to do this at this time. Why? I have to have these 5 pages written by this point because that's what I have to do. That's what I've set. So I think deadlines don't necessarily have to be painful.
Yeah, but I do like that. Time is very valuable, and I think it's very valuable as a writer, especially. Because you do need to, it's true, you do need to set those restrictions and those deadlines on yourself. So if you're someone who's like us, who loves to do creative writing, but also has jobs to do, and families, I think it's really important to, when you're starting out especially, to set aside that time. And then I think it could be also just as equally important to respect the time when the time ends. If you set aside 2 hours to write at a certain day, when that 2 hours is up, you have to let it go, because consistency is something that's very important in order to get actual long form stories done. You can crank out a short story real quick sometimes over a day. But if you're dedicated to actually writing a full-on book or a script or something like that, it's that regular, 2 hours, that regular repetition, and sticking to that schedule and respecting those timelines, those boundaries. That's important to really getting it done. Now, the next thing probably that you're thinking is what you're going to write. You might want to write, but I think it's important to also decide what you're going to write. And that's, as Catholic filmmakers and storytellers, I think our faith, both of us, really factors largely into the stories that we tell. And so I also wanted to bring up what that process looks like for a faith-based storyteller. And now you've written a lot of scripts. So that's a different perspective from me. So I wanted to get your thoughts on what it is, selecting the type of story that you want to tell. Like, obviously, you and I are making the Socrati, so that's a horror film, which is we've spoken about that a little bit too. But it's a very unusual and interesting choice to write and produce and create a faith-based film that's a horror movie. So tell me a little bit about, how do you go about deciding what you're going to write, and what inspires that process?
Well, the inspiration for that film came from a conversation you and I had. You remember when we were talking about the DC-5, the horror
Mm.
of
Mm-hmm.
these 5 babies that were found mutilated and illegally, and in that even in DC, illegal for DC, killed via partial birth abortion. Um, that's just when you unpack the details of this gruesome case, it was enough to say, okay, let's tell a fairy tale that unpacks the horror of this. Just like every aspect of it, from the spiritual to the actual physical, what does that look like, the physical, without actually talking about abortion, you know?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, so if you kind of step back from that particular example, you see inspiration coming from, you know, a deep spiritual, a deep belief in spiritual reality. And that's kind of where I always get ideas for stories is, okay, I'm seeing something, I'm reacting to it physically as well as emotionally. Why is this happening? Like, why does this catch my interest? Why am I invested in what I'm hearing, what I'm listening, what I'm reading? Um, and then how do I pursue that back to its original ends, to its source?
Mm-hmm.
And that's always a spiritual question in the end. So as a writer who's a Christian, you know, how do you write stories as a Christian, as a conservative, as a Catholic? You write them better than anyone else because you have deep-seated convictions that come from a long tradition, a long standing, you know, that allows you to draw from a wealth of truth that seeds your stories, and then it influences how you take in what you see. I mean, another example of that is The Extrovert. You know, I was reading The Extrovert is the first, it's not the first script I wrote, but it's the first feature film that we produced together, Peter and I. And I was reading about someone who was studying near-death experiences where people were dead, you know, medically speaking, dead, and in the hospital, and the doctors called it, and then they've come back, um, and you know, been alive again, and they would come back with knowledge of things that they shouldn't know, like what was happening in the room when they were dead, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And the researchers, they weren't Christian, they were just researching this phenomenon, and they kind of shrugged. They were like, we don't know why this is happening, but it is, you know? And for me, I was like, there's a story here. Like, let's unpack this. Why is this so interesting? So Christians have have a huge advantage because there's all these things that aren't explained in our world.
Mm.
And that's rife for stories. That's especially fairy tales like the one that we're making now. What about you?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think, yeah, on that note, you really are speaking about how it's really the duty of Catholic, especially storytellers and artists, to tell truly incredible stories. And I think that's something that we forget very often today. Like, I don't want to criticize, you know, Catholic artists, modern Catholic artists, you know, because I think it's important for artists to kind of hold each other up and to try to support each other. But we really do not have anywhere near the grandeur and the really the majesty that Catholic art has had in the past, in ages past. Today, we just don't have that. You look at the cathedrals and the basilicas of Europe, or even in South America and in Mexico, and you see what Catholics were able to achieve because of their incredible faith and the dedication that they had to their faith and to their craft. You don't see that at all in any way, shape, or form that anywhere close to compares to what we used to have. And so I think it's what you were saying is very true. We have this huge wellspring to draw from, and that at the same time gives us a duty to actually create something to the best of our ability, to not use faith, oh, it's a faith story, it's a faith-based thing, as an excuse for it to be mediocre, or it's there's plenty of Christian films out there that are just awful, that are just really bad, really corny, and I think that they rely on that kind of trope of it's a Christian film, so this is the audience. But on that same note, when it comes to selecting what kind of story you want to write, I do think it's equally important to understand who your audience is.
Yeah.
And you were talking about, you're reading these accounts of people who are dying and are going comatose and going into a coma, but then come back being able to say what was happening in the room. That is kind of that makes a sci-fi kind of feel to it. It's actually happening, but it's a sci-fi story. And so you cater your story for the rest, keep that in mind, who the audience is and what kind of story you're telling. So that's something that's important at the very beginning when you're writing your story, when you're deciding what you want to write, and then when you're writing your whole process throughout, keeping in mind that the audience that you're speaking to. Because the best type of storyteller is someone who caters each story to their audience, I think that you kind of.
Who do you think are, like, suppose you're just starting out, like maybe you haven't got that job as a writer yet, but you're not sure what your audience is like, So I want to take your advice, what you're saying right now, know your audience. What would you tell that person? Like, how do you know who your audience is?
Well, I think definitely for me, and I think for you, we really look to some giants, some icons of Catholic storytelling, Catholic storytellers, and they are people who definitely really understood their craft and their audience. I mean, you look at the difference between someone like G.K. Chesterton, who writes, I think in many ways, Chesterton to me he has a mastery of the English language.
Oh, yeah.
And he has a deep understanding of this kind of magical reality, I think. And each one of his works really is imbued with that sense of magic and that sense of just complete mastery of the English language. And so he is writing there for an audience that was looking for that. But at the same time, we have artists like Stan Lee, who imbues his own faith in his own way into his work. You read the original Marvel comics written by Stan Lee, and it is plainly evident that they're written by a person of faith. So
Avengers 9, like that's the perfect example.
Yeah, no, you can definitely tell, and but at the same time, like, that is obviously an extremely different type of story. It's action, it's superheroes, it's fighting. It's something that you might not really see at face value as anything to do with faith. But yet he's able to imbue that sense of faith and faithfulness into his stories. Like, each one, even if you're not talking about points where it's like you see it very obviously, like you were saying, it's still the values that undergird each of the struggles in each story, and each of the heroes, their philosophies, their problems, their everything that's happening in the world is undergirded by those values. And so, but to the point that we're discussing here, they stick to their medium. They stick to the type of story that they're telling. You don't have every Marvel comic has a fight. No one wants to read a comic where they're just like philosophizing all throughout the entire edition, right?
Well, this isn't this isn't for the audience, then this is for you and me. I hope the audience doesn't mind. Does that present a problem for us? We've already said that the faith-based audience is used to things that we're not interested in telling, you know, like it's the film equivalent of an altar call, for example, you know, where you're very explicitly saying, this is a Christian thing. This is, you know, you should be in church or whatever it is, you know, like whatever that common faith-based film trope is. But we don't want to do that. Do you think that causes, like, our audience is not, our audience wants that, the kind of the classic faith-based film fare?
You know, I think there obviously is a market, and there is an interest in that type of faith storytelling, because the you know, you can tell because they exist, you know, so obviously there's interest in that type of storytelling. But I think we definitely, as the Pinedo Brothers, have kind of operated on this this belief that there are Catholics and people of faith and people of values who really want to have very interesting and very, you know, dynamic types of stories told that share a sense of values that's rooted in Christianity. And so I don't think that the Christian, what I'm saying is, I don't think the Christian audience is just looking for, you know, altar call kind of stories. There might be a group of them that are, but I think there's a much, much larger group that is actually looking for something very different than that, something that has that faith aspect to it, and that it's imbued throughout the story, but it's not just that, you know, that message that's just being pushed at you. I'm definitely one of those people myself. I love a story that has that type of faith aspect to it, but I'm not going to watch some, you know, Bible thumping kind of movie at the same time. So that's not to bash really on that at all, but it's to say that, I mean, I believe there's definitely a much larger audience that's looking for something different. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I would add, I think that Hollywood's infatuation with woke culture, with woke dogma, really, where each film needs to be imbued with a dogmatic representation, a dogmatic emphasis on the facts that we are woke and you should be too. Mm-hmm. The fact that every Hollywood film is imbued with that sort of message gives a huge audience that doesn't want to be preached to a need to look elsewhere. And so we have a little bit of a moment where if people are not wanting to be preached to, then they can't consume Hollywood, which is where you used to go not to be preached to. And if people don't want to be preached to, they can't consume the traditional faith-based fare, well, then maybe there's a need for a content like ours more than ever. So that's kind of where I would posit that mm-hmm. where I see our audience lying. But in any case, I'm sorry, I'm making you digress. Continue on.
No, not at all. I mean, I do just look at the last few Disney films that came out. They did not perform well at all in the box office.
Right.
So there's a demand for a different type of story that's mm-hmm. than what's being told right now. So now that means it's an exciting time for us writers. For anyone, you know, who's watching this video who wants to write and tell stories, this is a great time to want to do that, because there is a hunger and there's a need in this culture for something than what's been given right now.
Right.
And that's very obvious just on a purely like numbers basis. You can see that the films being produced and put out there right now are not performing well.
That's right.
So that creates a wonderful opportunity for you and I, and for anyone who's watching this who wants to tell a story that's different.
Let's give them some really practical advice for the writers listening.
Right. Okay. So I think, to me, what I think of next is, as a writer, you have to make sacrifices, right, for your story. To me, one of the biggest problems that I face oftentimes is that I'm caught up in that desire to want to make this story perfect and wonderful and like the best story that's ever been told. But as a practical piece of advice, the best thing that you can really do is realize that's the best that you can do at that moment, you know? So I think a finished story is better than, you know, a perfect story. If you're waiting to make it perfect, it might never be done, you know? And I don't think that any writer, even the greatest writers that we know and we look up to and uphold, I don't think they were ever fully satisfied, at least what we know from them, ever fully satisfied with the story that they wrote and how it ended up being. I know people like J.R.R. Tolkien definitely struggle with this same problem, where he started on something and it became something great and something huge, much bigger than he ever envisioned, but he still wasn't satisfied. He had that. I think that's the common struggle that all artists and storytellers have.
I remember Chesterton once wrote a foreword for one of his novels where he said he wrote a poem where it says, "So this is very bad. Send it away for it makes me sad," or something like that, where he's bashing his own novel. Chesterton bashing his own novel because it's bad. Said, "Send it away to Egmont Dwight." I don't remember what rhymed with Egmont Dwight, but it was something like that. So yes, even the big guys.
Yeah. And so that's one piece, you know. You'll have to, in the end, you'll have to sacrifice completing a story for perfection. But other than what we said, you know, selecting what you're wanting to write, sticking to it, creating that regular schedule whether it's like an hour in each morning. Some people, I think, are not really able to zone in and get enough done in just an hour. So if you're that person, which is totally fine, you'll have to set aside maybe 2 hours every other day or something like that. If you need a longer block of time, you can adjust for that. But if you are one of those people who can zone in and is able to do that just once, you know, 1 hour each day to get a little bit done, that's a wonderful thing, because I do think that writing each day really does help kind of break any barriers that you're having to that being able to get that story out. Because some days you might write, 2 sentences in that 1 hour, but then maybe another day you're going to be writing multiple pages. You and I, back in the LA days, we used to go to, what was that Mexican restaurant called that was open like 24/7?
Mexican restaurant. I don't remember I remember Aroma yes. Cafe. That was, I didn't call that a Mexican restaurant.
No. So the Aroma was one of them, but there was this other one. It was this restaurant in LA where it was open really late. So we would go there and we would just write, and there was always like a whole bunch of teenagers flirting with each other. And it was a very loud and chaotic place to be. It was somewhere. Of
course, I know what you're talking. It wasn't a Mexican food restaurant. I remember it now.
We found a place. You found a place that you're able to write, and that's really where I wrote a large portion of The Unfollowed. And so that place that works for you, that helps you to zone in and be able to get that writing done, is different for each person, you know. So I can't say, oh, you need to go to a library and bury yourself in the subterranean floor of some library, because for some people maybe that's more distracting, and maybe they can't work in that environment. I really do think that every artist is different. Yeah. So I think you need my practical piece of advice there would be to find the place that works for you, and then continue going there.
Habits, we're routine. You know, we need routine. Mm-hmm. So whatever your routine is, you find it. What about publishing? Suppose you've finished something. Any tips for getting it published?
Yeah, so there's different ways that you could do it. For my book, I went to Amazon. And Amazon is super, super easy, which is really great. It's there is a process where you have to get your book. It is reviewed by Amazon. They go through it, make sure there's not, offensive content and stuff like that, which I don't know if it might be a little bit different from when I published a couple of years ago. But I didn't have any issues. So if you're looking for a way to get your book published and then out into the public very easily, Amazon is a great option to go through. They do it through something called print on demand, so that you don't actually have to purchase large quantities of your book in order to get it printed. It's actually just printed each time that it's bought and purchased. And obviously the drawback on that is that you don't have any advertising for your book. So if any kind of advertising that you want to get done is going to be solely on yourself to get something like that done. But it can be a really good way to start. If you do want to have that advertising done, then there's different ways you can do that too. Obviously, the most common way is to go to a publisher. And again, that's where you're going to be looking at what kind of story did I write? What kind of story am I working on here? And that will determine what type of publisher you're going to be looking to. And this, as in many things, is it's salesmanship. You're going to have to sell your book to this publisher and to pitch it to them in the manner that they want to be pitched to. So again, this is type of storytelling. It's going to require creativity on your own part again. So if it's let's say it's a Catholic story, there's all these different types of Catholic publishers, and there's variation in that Catholic publishing world as well. Of course, if you have anybody, the best thing you can always do with any kind of business related thing is, if you have any contacts, definitely hitting them up and seeing what kind of strings you can get pulled. But that's not to say that you can't get a story published through, a cold call. It might be more rare, but I think it's definitely something that's been done before. So never assume that your story is not going to be printed, or have that be a reason that you don't finish your story, or you don't start your story, or keep on working on it. Again, in order to do either of these options, you really have to be very focused on creating a high quality piece of work. Especially, honestly, either way, you're going to have to do a lot of your own editing. You don't want to send a sloppy piece of work either, even if it's to Amazon, because you're going to be publishing something and that's the way it's going to be. They're not going to fix it for you. And there's all these wonderful softwares that you can use. It's a great time with all this technology that we have to help us out. Now that I've been writing, professionally as well, I've really developed a whole method for editing my work.
Oh, wow.
I run it through multiple different processors. I'll oftentimes, you'll start in Word, Microsoft Word, and what I do is I'll type my story, type out my whatever it is that I'm writing, and then I'll have the Microsoft Word spell check go through and grammar check and run through all of those errors and correct them. And then I call it the robot. The Microsoft Word has this feature where you can have it read it to you. So wow. I'll have the robot read it to me. And the reason I do that is because oftentimes you're working on a very tight deadline where you don't have the ability to set the story aside and get some distance from it. And that's something we haven't quite mentioned yet, but often that is something that's important. When you're writing, if you've just completed something, the ideal thing to be able to do is to set it aside for a day or two and just kind of let it sit. So you have that separation develop between you and what you wrote, so that you can come back to it and read it more critically and realize and see the errors that you've made. But if you're working on something on a very tight deadline, obviously you can't do that. If it needs to be out today, then it needs to be out today. And so this Microsoft Word, it gives you the robot gives you a wonderful ability to have that artificial separation, because someone else is reading it to you and you're listening. So that's something wonderful. And then after that, then I'll run it through Grammarly, which is another editing software. So I would highly recommend that as well.
Thank you. You're welcome, Grammarly, for this.
Yeah.
They're not
but
paying.
I mean, no, they're not, but it is a good software. And then even that makes mistakes as well. There's been multiple times where it's not caught something. And so I run it through a third processor again. So it's really important to really emphasize that editing process. And that, kind of like we were talking about last week with filmmaking, is the editing section part of your storytelling. It can be very grueling, but it's just as important as the production side. And that's the same deal with writing.
Yeah.
I know we're getting real short on time here.
Well, I wanted to just jump on what you said previously, which is you have to sell your stories. No matter what, if you're writing short stories, you're writing novels, if you're writing marketing pitches, or if you're writing screenplays, my favorite, you need to be always ready when someone asks, what are you working on, to pitch very excitedly, very enthusiastically, whatever it is you're most excited about, whatever it is you want to sell to this person. You don't even have to know who the person is, but be generous with, because it is difficult. It is difficult, but be generous with your time and your passion, and explain what it is that you're working on and why you're excited about it, why it's so great. Always be ready for that. One other thing to say is put yourself in situations where people might ask you what you're working on. So that would be writers' meetups, producers' meetups, networking events, even, stuff at your local church. If it's a gathering of people at your church and they want to know who you are, say you're a writer, and then they might ask what you're working on. And then you could tell them, just be very bold about what it is you do and why you're so excited about how you do it. Never shy away from talking about your stories. That's the big thing I would impart to people who are wanting to sell, to publish, to do whatever it is that has to do with writing and their ability to write stories.
Right, absolutely. And it goes back to the fact that now is the perfect time to be a storyteller and to be a writer, and to someone who's wanting to share stories, especially that are imbued with this sense of faith that we as Christians and Catholics are really wanting to be able to share. So let that be a sense of encouragement for you. If you're someone who's wanting to share stories, it's very possible that there's not been a better time to share and tell stories than right now. Right now we have the assistance of technology and the internet to be able to disperse, to create, and also to disperse our stories. At the same time, we live in a society that is very much hungering for the truth and hungering for stories that are imbued with the truth. So with that, I would say it's the perfect time to tell stories, and it takes that dedication and really that courage to sit down and get the work done.
Perfect. Well, Peter, thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thank you for joining me, JP, and thanks for joining us, everyone else watching. We hope you enjoyed this episode. We'll be back next week, and we hope you'll be joining us. In the meantime, check out the Socrati link in the description and pre-order. And it really, check it out. It's going to be a lot of fun. We'll be keeping you updated on the whole process throughout pre-production, production, and post-production. So stay tuned, and there's a lot more to come.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Pinedo Brothers Podcast. We hope you enjoyed it, and if so, please consider subscribing, and commenting below. That really helps. This episode was edited and recorded by me, JP. Makeup was done by no one, if you couldn't tell. The Pinedo Brothers are Catholic filmmaking brothers working to revitalize the world of Catholic art through film. For more information on us, check us out at pinedobrothers.com. Thanks again.